Hey guys, this is the Academic Christian here. I'm doing a video on can evolution fit into a biblical worldview. Now, I don't know about y'all. I come from a science related background. It is not biology, but I'm thoroughly invested into research. That's what I'm right now working on my doctorate degree in. And so, through studying, obviously, the theory of evolution is a solid theory, at least in my opinion. My goal is not really to change how people view evolution. You can believe in creation, all that sort of stuff, and or you could believe in evolution. I believe that, we as Christians, we are on the same team, but I also believe that there is a problem that is facing us with typically evolution is one of the first pillars to cause people to end up being atheist. And I think that by looking at Hebrew scholars and looking at biblical evidence, we can see that it doesn't really go into in depth of how God created everything. And it shows that the theory of evolution is actually compatible with the Bible if that is what you end up choosing to believe as your biblical narrative. It's important to look at people in the past. A lot of times when I look at biblical advice, I try to go to the closest to the source. Looking at St. Augustine, he was a bishop back in the day and he was Roman Catholic. I myself am not a Roman Catholic. I'm a Messianic Jew, but I listen to a lot of what the Catholics have to say. And so he realized that Genesis, all the way back then, before evolution was even thought of, he didn't take a literal interpretation of Genesis because there seems to be a possible problem here. Even back then, it was that the plants were made before the sun and the moon. And if you understand how photosynthesis works, this, at least to me, would create a major problem. And so even back then, they took to a different take on Genesis way before evolution was even thought of. In addition to this, I also look at different biblical theologians. One is John Walton, and if you study Hebrew like me, you know bara oftentimes means create. John Walton notes that bara could also mean the assignment of functions. Now, from my look at this, I see that John Walton's in the minority. And see, with me being a research person, I like to have things that back up things. So I don't necessarily know whether bara would mean create or the assignment of functions, but it didn't necessarily say how God created everything. And I'm about to get to this in a moment. So regardless of whether it meant assignment of functions or not, it could have also been God assigning everything into the universe. This is also noted by Junker, who notes that God assigned functions to challenge other deities. See, the problem that happened back then was there were cultures that had multiple gods. And it was basically saying, hey, we got one God, we got the God who assigned everything into the universe, and he is almighty and he is all powerful. It doesn't note exactly how he creates it, but this is what happened. Other theologians look at the creation story of God assigned functions. And through the assignment of functions, the universe was created over a longer period of time. So Adam is also, he could be meant to be a symbol of Israel. If you're me, I believe Adam, of course, was a real person. It mentions that in the Bible. And it mentions it quite a lot. And it mentions that he was the first person. And I even believe that too. And I believe that there was a place in the Garden of Eden. You see, when we talk about Adam and it talking about being the first person, It's very interesting to note that Scripture, especially if you take it in high authority, which you should, and you got to be very careful with this because you don't want to take the authority of God for granted. Now, when looking at this, it's very important to note that Adam, this is what I believe. You look at the Bible, Cain took a wife outside of the garden. And since he took a wife outside of the garden, it's interesting to note, was there life outside of the garden? And so what I think is very, very possible, very plausible, is that people were evolving outside of the garden. You know, there are people who think that Adam evolved over time inside the garden. I personally don't believe that. Even though I feel evolution is a solid theory, I believe God actually did create Adam and Eve in full form. But that doesn't explain everything that could have possibly went on outside of the garden. I believe over time, because we look at it, we looked at how the universe itself was set in motion, how God could have assigned function into the universe. It doesn't say specifically how he did it. And we're about to also get into the note of 7 being figurative. But if it doesn't explain how he did it, there could be life outside of the garden. So I know that my God is all-knowing and all-powerful. And he knew that Adam and Eve would eventually mess up. He knew they would eventually sin, but he still gave them a chance and free will. So I believe inside the Garden of Eden was a perfect paradise where there was no death. There was nothing like that. But outside of the garden, while this was all happening, or before this happened, God had animals and things there, and things evolved over time. Obviously, you know, there's more in depth to the theory of evolution than that. I'm just going basic because I'm going for a biblical interpretation. So around the time Adam would have been alive, there would have been people that would have been outside of the garden. I believe Adam was the first man, but you had lesser species of humans outside of the garden that eventually became fully evolved to what we are now. I think it makes sense in this because obviously Cain got a wife outside of the garden. So that's my take on that. Now I'm going to go a little more in depth about how things are about with the number 7. Now, with looking how even people in the past saw that it wouldn't have been possible for a literal 7-day creation is one of the starts, because even people back then kind of knew how life worked. They didn't have the scientific understanding we have now. And when looking at this, I know that it's possible life could have happened outside of the garden. God typically takes long periods of time for things to work out. It notes in the Bible that one day to man is like 1,000 years to God. And so I'm not telling you take that as a literal interpretation of 1,000-year periods. I'm not a day in gap fan. But this notes that God could have taken a long time to do everything, which outside of the garden, he could have had things evolving, and then he could have physically created the garden, which would have been the paradise that Adam and Eve could have been in. It's very possible. I'm not one who believes that Adam and Eve were the only people. People could have been evolving slowly before God made Adam and Eve at fully form. Adam and Eve may have been made fully formed because they were made in the image of God. They would have been the people who would have came from the tribe of Israel. It would have eventually noted that so Christ could come, they had to be made in God's image. And obviously, Christians are now grafted into that. So it's very interesting, at least looking at it through that way. Understanding this too is God wanted everything to work, and he takes long periods of time to work. So obviously he knew Adam and Eve would do this, which was why his plan, because he's all-knowing, he had something happening outside of the garden. He's a long-term thinker. This also does with Jesus, because we knew sin came, but it took a long time for Christ to come. and sacrifice himself on the cross. So now looking also, it's also related to the temple. God wanted us to do a certain thing. It shows a connectedness to us and God. And so 7 is noted several times in the Bible. And on the 7th day, quote unquote, he rested. And so because the 7th day he rested, it was like, because we're in his image, he wanted us to rest. It shows how we are close to him. It had to be made also in a period where people in the past had to be able to understand it. Numbers in the Bible are typically used again and again and again. It shows that we're dependent on him. We need this God, our God in our life, to be saved. And so understanding how the temple works, in the 7th day he wanted us to rest. It's important to note that it was showing how close we are to him, and this is the rules of, how the temple and the tabernacle were. On the 7th day, God wanted us to rest and worship him, which this was something all the way back in Genesis before the Sabbath was in the 10 Commandments. So this video isn't really to turn people away from even believing in creation. You can do that. This is mainly for people who are on the fence, people who might be atheists, and the reason they don't believe in God is because the theory of evolution seems to contrast with what modern Christians seem to think, some of them. And it's very interesting to note, if you look at the biblical scholars, you look at Hebrew, and you look at how things happened at the setting when they were around, you have to note that, of course, they had to understand it based on their time period. You had people back in the day who didn't think that there was a literal 7-day creation. You see the connectedness with man and the tabernacle. You see how it's possible bara could mean create. I don't know if I think that, not create, I'm sorry, I mean to assign functions. I sit there and look at it like this. God seemed to do this as symbolic based on the 7 days to match up with us. It's to show how we're connected to him. And if you even note in the Bible, it kind of shows that the 7 days showed the importance of everything. Everything that was coming, it started with very simple things. And then it got to the very end, which was man. And if you sit there and think of the biblical understanding, we would have been towards the end. And we were made in his image. So it shows that it's very possible, if you take a non-literal approach, or you look at it as this wasn't the exact order of how it happened, or if you take it as just it took a very long period of time, looking at the 7 days to connect us with him, it's very easy. And to look at it this way, it shows just us needing the God and needing to rest on a 7th day. A lot of this shows symbolism, important symbolism that the Hebrews back then would have understood. So guys, I want to thank you for watching this video. If you happen to enjoy it, like and subscribe.